Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second installment of the Wesen Podcast. So, what is on the agenda today? Well, we'll be discussing the phenomenon of identitarianism. What is identitarianism? It is the art of couching political grievances and aspiration in terms of one's group identity. It's pretty commonplace in modern politics. Uh, Essentially, it's crafting a political message or a platform or an identity that is solely based on one's belonging to a particular social group. So, what does this look like in practice? Well, we've seen people like Zoran Mamdani specifically amplify in their campaigns how they are representing the interests of immigrant New Yorkers, Muslim New Yorkers, other groups, etc. So that is making a political argument specifically on the basis of representing the interests of a particular social group. But this phenomenon, I'm going to argue, is not just restricted to the left, it also occurs on the right increasingly now. So, for the longest time, the right was actually a critic of the left for reducing everything to race, sex, gender, etc. But now we're seeing this emergent trend on the right as well. With people like Nick Fuentes gaining popularity, who calls for white people to develop a political consciousness, this trend is also being popularized on the right. And you also have people like Tucker Carlson specifically endorsing the great replacement theory. So essentially, what modern politics looks like today is different people couching political arguments in terms of social identity. And that is what I call the phenomenon of identitarianism. So that is the first thing we'll be doing in today's podcast. It is discussing this notion of identitarianism. But the second thing we'll be doing is trying to figure out if there's a lexicon or a conceptual tool that can help us address this phenomenon as and present an alternative to it. So I'm going to suggest in this podcast that the rise of identitarianism is not great for democratic political institutions. It means that politics basically gets reduced to a tribal zero-sum struggle of one identity group against another, and it's really not great for the institutional fabric. So the second thing we're going to be doing in this podcast is trying to figure out if there's some way we can tackle this rise of identitarianism and provide a conceptual alternative to it. I'm going to suggest that Rousseau's constitutionalism may provide an alternative. What is Rousseau's constitutionalism? We'll get into it later in this podcast, but for now, you can understand it as an act of moral transcendence in which people put aside their petty agendas that serve their particular interests and rather think of their political identity as being subjects of a unified moral whole that is the polity. So it's a specific form of republicanism, and we'll get into what it looks like. But it's essentially a yearning for a positive freedom, a yearning for a positive political identity that is not rooted in arbitrary social facts, but in a moral governing of oneself. So that is what we'll be looking at. Before I go further into the podcast, I do want to point out that essentially the installments of this podcast are based on the writings I do on Substack for Wesen as a publication. Uh, this particular podcast is based on a piece titled Rousseau's Constitutionalism, an Antidote to Identitarianism. It's the same title as the title of this podcast. So I do hope that you would check that out on Substack. The link is in the description below. And if you like this sort of content, do subscribe to the Substack and also to this YouTube channel, because these are the sorts of issues that we'll be looking at in this podcast. So I want to begin by looking at what identitarianism looks like in the modern political climate. I will argue that Modern identitarianism comes primarily in two varieties. One of these is the theory of intersectionality that has found a lot of currency on the left, and the other is the theory of great replacement that has come to fore on the right. And so we'll be exploring both. We'll begin by looking at the theory of intersectionality. So essentially, this theory posits this, that Western society, and generally speaking, European and North American democracies, are based or founded on a set of oppressive power structures. These power structures underpin the socio political reality of these societies. So, what are these power structures? Well, you may have heard these names before, but they include white supremacy, heteronormativity, ableism, masculinity, colonialism, etc. Uh, so we'll look at the intellectual foundations of this theory later, but for now, this theory essentially works in four steps. First, it says that the world can be categorized in terms of these binary political groupings. So, men and women, gay and straight, white and non white, colonizer and colonized, etc. So, this part of the theory is particularly Marxist. So, this has been borrowed from Marx, who basically said that the world can be divided in terms of the exploitative bourgeoisie and the proletariat. So this theory borrows that from Marx and says, the world can be categorized in these binomial political groupings. There are men who are the oppressors and women who are the oppressed. Straight people who are the norm and the oppressors, and gay people who are the oppressed, white versus non-white, etc. Second, it talks about how the relationship between these binomial groupings, between men and women, gay and straight, white and non-white, etc., can be understood fundamentally in terms of power. So one party is in power, the other is not in power, right? One is the dominant party, the men are the dominant party under patriarchy, and the women are the ones who are oppressed. So it speaks of the other party in terms of marginalization. So there's the dominant party, and then there's the marginalized party, which is the other. So that's why you hear this language a lot on the left, which is the marginalized, the otherized, the weak, the oppressed, etc. Third, this theory posits that the objective of those on the marginalized end is to engage in a political struggle against the dominant group to overcome their marginalization. So the aim of the otherized or the marginalized, the women, the gay, the people of color, is to rise to the ascendant position, rise to the dominant position, and they should use all political and socially available tools to do that. So protests, courts, media, etc., all should be used to achieve that political objective of liberation from oppression. And finally, this theory adds some complexity to its structure by saying that, one person can be subject to various power structures, so that there are multiple axes of identitarian struggle that are created. So, a black, able bodied woman, for example, is subject to two distinct oppressive social structures that intersect. And that's where it gets its name, intersectionality. So, a black woman, for example, is subject both to white supremacy as a result of her blackness, but also the patriarchy as a result of her being a woman. So, her political aim has two axes: it's to undermine white supremacy, but also undermine the patriarchy. That's how intersectionality works. So, what are the intellectual foundations of this theory? Well, it relies heavily on the work of the postmodern left that emerged in France after World War II. So, we've already looked at how it conceives of the world in terms of binomial groupings like Marx did. But then it borrows this concept of power from the postmodern left. In particular, I'm going to go on a bit of a digression here and talk about Michel Foucault's conception of power, which this theory relies on. So, for Michel Foucault, power was not just a means of achieving a specific political end. It wasn't necessarily always explicit, but power was generative of social reality. Uh, in his book, Discipline and Punish, which is very popular, it's a seminal work, he goes through this thought experiment of the panopticon. What is the panopticon? Well, it's a prison where there is a tower at the very center, and the prison guards are stationed within that tower, and all around are prison cells. So Foucault gets this idea, I think, borrows this idea, I think, from Bentham, Jeremy Bentham. But essentially, what the illusion or the impression that the panopticon prison creates is that the guards are at all times watching the prisoners in their prison cells. And the effect that Foucault notes that this has is that power becomes internalized within the very subjectivity of the prisoners, so that the acts they perform, they are performing because they see themselves as prisoners who are constantly being surveilled. So you don't actually need explicit power to operate on the prisoners when you can give them the impression that they're constantly being watched. So the prisoners, Foucault notes, in and of themselves, on their own accord, will get up in the morning, you know, make tidy up their prison cell, do all sorts of activities, and the effect that the panopticon has on them is to internalize the structure of power within their subjectivity, so that they do not need to be explicitly compelled. And so that is how this intersectional left looks at power. So when it looks at the structure of white supremacy, when it talks about white supremacy, it's not necessarily talking about explicit power or explicit laws, but it's talking about, you'll hear this word a lot, structural trends, right? So it's saying power operates through a bunch of implicit notions that have become internalized within the subjectivity of people in society that acts makes them act a certain way. So the way the power structure of white supremacy operates is that people see whiteness as the norm, as the default, and that is the basic notion of power that intersectionality relies upon. So, intersectionality essentially is developed as a legal theory, and it borrows heavily from this notion of postmodernism that we've looked at specifically in Foucault. But really, it's Foucault being taken up, Foucault and Marx being taken up in the context of American race relations that gives us intersectionality. So, critical race theory is the predecessor of intersectionality. Critical race theory specifically looks at race relations in America from a Foucauldian lens, from a Marxist lens, and then, you know, people like Kimberly Crenshaw develop the notions, the lessons of critical race theory further and give us the theory of intersectionality. And you might think, well, this is all abstract academic stuff. You know, does it have any impact on popular politics? And it does. It's basically intersectionality that has become popularized as diversity, equity, and inclusion culture, the the DEI culture that we see in America today. So this is obviously was very became very popular in the past decade in corporate America. But also, you'll see politicians come up to the stage and say things like, as a Black American or as a woman, my lived experience directs that I do this or do that. And essentially, that is an appeal to this notion of intersectionality. It is the idea that because of one's status as a political other, as the politically marginalized, they have access to some epistemic truth that others do not, and that this equips the person to represent a specific political position or a political agenda. So this idea of intersectionality has become very, very popular on the left. It is the predominant mode of discourse on the left. Uh, and so, yeah, I will argue that this notion of intersectionality is essentially a form of identitarianism. Why? Because it is relying on one's social characteristics, one's belonging to a specific group, such as being a woman, being black, being Muslim, or being gay, and it's crafting a political agenda and a political identity merely out of that. So there's nothing on top of it. It's just because I'm black, I have to have this politics. Because I'm brown, I have to argue this, etc. So it is a form of identitarianism, and it is the original form of identitarianism that was introduced to Western politics by a bunch of intellectuals, and it's become the predominant mode of discourse on the left. So that is the first variant of identitarianism we see on the left. Uh, as I said, more recently we've also seen identitarianism on the right, a specific form in the notion of the great replacement theory. So, for the longest time on the right, you'd have politicians, you'd have intellectuals actually criticizing the left on the fact that all of leftist politics was based on these identitarian struggles on the basis of one's, belonging to a specific group. So, you know, everything was about race, gender, sexual identity, etc. But now you're seeing a distinct sort of identitarianism rise on the right with people such as Nick Fuentes, such as Tucker Carlson, and others, and many others. Charlie Kirk was one of them as well, the late Charlie Kirk. So, what is this modern form of identitarianism on the right? Well, we see it in the notion of the great replacement. And the great replacement is basically a theory developed by a French writer called Renaud Camus. Uh, he essentially comes up with this notion of the great replacement. If you read his work, the great replacement theory has basically four premises. Uh, The first is that, contrary to the predominant view, race is fundamentally real. So, liberalism tells us race doesn't matter, race is irrelevant. People are people who are rational actors who, maximize their interests. So, all these parochial kinds of identities, such as nationality, race, group belonging, they're all irrelevant. This theory argues no, people are not undifferentiated human matter, as Renaud Camus has put it, but belong to specific races and civilizations, and that these belongings give them certain characteristics. So people from, white people are distinct from people of other races. There's distinct civilization and races that constitute the world. The second premise is that a brutal change of population or a replacement is being orchestrated by the socio-economic elites in Europe and North America. So the argument is that the wide population of these continents is being replaced by people from various other parts of the world through immigration policies. The evidence that is usually cited in favor of this proposition is the trajectory of the decline in the white population and its birth rate relative to the increase in the immigrant population of North America and European countries. The third premise is that the replacement of the white population in North America and Europe has led to a fundamental and detrimental change in the character of these countries. So you'll hear the argument very often being articulated on the right now that if you import the third world, you become the third world. So the argument is that American and European cities have gone to ruin because you have imported the people from the third world who are fundamentally distinct and cannot acclimate to the culture of these places. Uh, that's the third premise. And finally, the fourth premise is a political call to action. It is that the great replacement must be reversed, or at the very least halted immediately through appropriate immigration policies. Uh, so yeah, that is the notion of the great replacement. The replacement, obviously, the replacement of the white population of the North American or European continent with the population of third world countries, as the right would argue. So, some proponents of the Great Replacement are prominent on the right, as I've said: Nick Fuentes, Charlie Kirk, Tucker Carlson, Laura Ingraham, and you'll see many others. You've seen it recently also more prominently in the language that Trump uses in his tweets about immigration policy. So, it's basically borrowing from this writer, Renaud Camus, who writes in the context of France and says, what are we doing immigrating half the third world into these countries that need this needs to stop. So you have these two forms of identitarianism, identitarian sort of discourse that rise both on the left and the right. And it's important to note that essentially what you have is that the great replacement theory, it can be conceptualized as almost a response to the rise of identitarian politics on the left. You know, the intersectional left for the longest time sought to undermine whiteness within North America and Europe. And part of that, you may argue, was importing a lot of people from other places into these countries. And the great replacement theory is really a response to that political attempt by the left, right? So that is the context. However, what unites both great replacement theory, the great replacement theory, and intersectionality is first that they're both identitarianism. As I said, they root political identity in one's social characteristics. But also, the other thing that unites them is the fact that they both reject liberalism entirely. So, for liberalism, as I've said, people are, rational actors. Group identities such as race, religion, family, and creed are parochial and outdated. Uh, Individuals, liberal theory argues, are political units in and of themselves who, endowed with rational agency, act to maximize their own interest and flourishing, and that any form of identification that subverts that logic should be rejected. So, identitarianism, both on the right and the left, is a specific repudiation of that liberal premise. And both the great replacement theory and intersectionality, in fact, tie one's political identity to a social fact about their being, such as their race, gender, their community, etc. So it's a complete repudiation of liberalism. And this repudiation comes specifically in the face of the failure of liberal capitalism to provide any sense of concrete political identity to individuals. Liberal capitalism tells you that all you are a self-interested individual, and you have to maximize your position in the market as a consumer, as a worker, as a capitalist, right? There's no positive sense of identity that liberal capitalism provides. In fact, if you follow your religion, if you follow your nation, if you follow your racial identity with too much conviction, that is actually an inconvenience to liberal capitalism, and it tells you that that's dangerous. So, in the face of this failure of liberalism to provide any sense of political identity, it is no wonder that identitarianism rises both on the right as well as on the left. So, this part of the podcast is an attempt at trying to find a solution to that. Why does there need to be a solution? Because, in the opinion of this podcast, tribal politics that relies merely on the idea of group identity is not productive for a democracy. It results in a fraying of public institutions or collapse of public institutions, a fraying of the social fabric, as well as a complete decline in the trust that people have uh, in the society itself. So it's a problem, and we need a way out of it. What I'm going to suggest is that Rousseau's constitutionalism as a conceptual tool may provide an answer. It's not going to be a magic pill, obviously, but in an environment where we all think of politics in terms of group identities, it may provide a lexicon to move forward in a more productive manner. So, we're going to explore Rousseau's constitutionalism. If you know nothing about Rousseau, he is considered one of the most prominent French thinkers from the Enlightenment. His magnum opus is the Social Contract, but he's written other books as well. Notable among them is Emile, which is essentially his dissertation on how to raise children. He had a lot of funky ideas. And because I'm proposing Rousseau's constitutionalism here as a solution, does not mean I agree with everything that Rousseau says everywhere. But it may provide a creative answer. So yeah, Rousseau was essentially an Enlightenment philosopher. Had a lot of radical ideas, influenced the French Revolution quite a bit. Also influenced a lot of the founders of America, the founding fathers, and so he was a very influential figure. And if you look at the American Constitution, the notion of "we the people" is very Rousseauian. So you have Rousseau, who's really influential in the founding of America. And essentially, what Rousseau does, along with Montesquieu to a certain extent, he takes the Roman notion of republicanism and he transports it into the context of the modern nation state. So, republicanism was really important in Rome. Rome was supposed to be a republic, and a republic translated literally means a thing of the people. This concept also has its root in the Athenian democracy, the Greek city states, from the era of Aristotle and Plato. So essentially, what Rousseau does during the Enlightenment is he looks to the past to come up with this notion of republicanism, this notion of political freedom, and applies it to modern European states. In Rome, it was in the context of the Roman Empire, which was not a modern nation state, really. In Athens, it's in the context of city states. But Rousseau basically takes that concept and says, how do we apply it in the modern post Enlightenment context? Uh, so he does this primarily in his magnum opus, The Social Contract. And the inquiry on which he embarks in that book is to find a way to make people free, morally free. He observes that men are born free but find themselves everywhere in chains. So, this is a very famous line. And then the question becomes, well, what can we do to make people free of these chains? Is there anything we can do? So, a note on the starting point that Rousseau takes. He takes men as they are and laws as they might be. So what does that mean? He does not start with the premise that as liberalism does, that men are these abstract individuals who are trying to maximize their self-interest. No, he understands that men are people are socially situated. They have certain modes of living, and so we're going to find them in these in this particularity. The question is how to take them from this particularity and then to bring them up to a universality that makes them politically free. And that is what he's going to try and answer in his book, The Social Contract. And the answer that Rousseau provides is a pretty radical one. So he says that men can be made morally free by coming together in a concrete political community as free and equal beings and forming a government that gives moral law to itself. So, as Rousseau puts it, and this concept, by the way, is known as his idea of the general will. So, it is all of us coming together to form a general will within the political community. This is how he puts it. Each of us puts his person and all his power in common under the supreme direction of the general will. And in our corporate capacity, that is, in our capacity as a political community, we receive each member as an individual part of the whole. So essentially, you have people from people who are socially situated in different ways coming together as equals and forming a political whole, a morally free political whole. So you'll notice that this general will provides a locus of identity distinct from one's private particular identity. So for Rousseau, members of the social contract alienate their private interests to the political whole in an act of self transcendence. So I do not care about who I am as a private member. I come together with fellow equal beings to form a political community and give myself moral law. So the idea of the general will dictates that when members of a political association act in their capacity as citizens, for example, voting in an assembly or executing their civic duties, they're not doing so with a reference to their private interests, but in terms of what would be best for the entire political community. So, if a particular political act is beneficial for the community but harmful to the individual in his private capacity, Rousseau's constitutionalism obligates the individual to act in the best interest of the community and contrary to their own private interests. So, the general will is not simply the aggregation of particular interests of the people that form the union, but it is something over and above that. It is a unified political and moral whole, right? So this idea is very distinct from liberal constitutionalism. The idea of liberal constitutionalism is we all have different interests, we all want different things. Let's come together in a way to make it tenable for us to exist together. So in the liberal tradition, rational political actors join together to constitute government, and their aim is very limited. It's to protect their own private particular interests, for example, their property, their businesses, etc. However, the civil union that Rousseau advocates for, the general will, it has a larger purpose. It's about achieving positive freedom and actualization of one's higher political identity. Its purpose is for a people to give morally legitimate law to itself, right? It is this unified whole, it is the life of the community. And that is the sense of civic virtue that Rousseau proposes. It's a big part of American politics. So if you look at American constitutionalism or the American Constitution, it's somewhat of a blend between Locke and Rousseau. So the Rousseauian version of it is out of the many, one. So you're taking the many particular people and you are forming a one unified whole out of that. Whereas the Lockean version is the severe limitations on power, the recognition of private property, freedom of conscience, etc. So it's a blend between the two. But what we've lost in the modern context is the Rousseauian part of that, where patriotism or republicanism has been entirely lost, and what we're left with essentially is a bunch of factions within the government that are each other at each other's throats. So the capitalist classes want, you know, business friendly regulations, lower taxes, anything that benefits them and their particular interests. They don't care about the workers. The workers, on the other hand, want, you know, wages that wages and regulation and laws that benefit them. They don't care about the political whole as a community. So what you have really is not a unified political community, but warring factions within that community. And so that is the context in which identitarianism rises, because the context that liberalism creates is that you are supposed to pursue your private interests within the political community. It's not about the unified political community and what is in its general interest. It's about what is in your interest. So, for example, Black people as a community want to forward their interest within the community, and they might want affirmative action. Other groups might want different things. Immigrant groups might want, freer borders or less border regulation. And so what politics becomes essentially is a war between different factions. And that is what gives rise to identitarianism. That is what identitarianism signifies. It's a bunch of different factions, each of which identifies with a particular social grouping, warring between themselves to affect their political agenda. What Rousseau's constitutionalism provides us with is perhaps an answer to that, in that people are supposed to put their private interests aside, come together as a concrete political community, and vote and act in ways that are in the best interests of that particular community. That is why I have proposed in this podcast and also in the piece that I wrote on this, that Rousseau's constitutionalism is what we're lacking today. And it might give us a path out of our particular dilemma. So, for example, if you are an immigrant to America or Europe, and you clearly see that further immigration is going to harm the community, even though it might be in your interest and your friends' interest to advocate for more immigration, your job is to look out for the entire political community of which you are a part. And in that sense, you have to vote against immigration. And that is a hypothetical, right? So that is how I understand Rousseau's constitutionalism, perhaps as providing an antidote to the rise of identitarianism that we see in today's politics. So that is it for today's podcast, for this installment of the podcast. If you enjoyed it, please do leave a comment and let me know your thoughts. Thank you so much for listening. Take care.